Greetings, fellow skeptics and lovers of Western culture in a way that is definitely not racist. Today, I'm gonna show you how offended and oversensitive the snowflake liberal left is nowadays by making a tedious video in which I whine about a fictional mermaid being black now and how this is somehow anything other than a banal casting choice deliberately made to rile up people like me and provide Disney with free marketing as well as increased ticket sales from people like me who will buy a ticket to see the film to hate watch it and complain about it afterwards to people who hate people like me and who'll go to watch it to show Disney that audiences support decisions like this. I am a mature adult man with a gratingly irritating voice and a lot more subscribers than you, which makes me uniquely placed to make statements like this is a bad idea and this is literally proof that Disney is trying to erase white men, which is objectively a bad thing, but I promise I'm not a racist. I believe only in facts and logic, and the feelings of anger and sadness I feel about one character in a movie not being white is not an example of me being emotional or putting feelings over facts. It is in fact my way of demonstrating that Disney is alienating its main audience for its princess movies, that of course being white men in their mid to late 20s. God, I'm so logical.
There's one longing to be thinner, that one wants to get the girl, and do I help them? Yes, indeed.
Did you hear about the Little Mermaid? She's black now, and this has caused all the racists in the world to collectively lose their shit and declare the end of Western civilization for the 17th time this year. I know, shock horror racists getting mad about black people existing, what a fucking turn up for the books. The right wing getting up in arms about a character in a popular movie franchise not being a straight white cis man for a change. Never heard of that happening before. The focus of today's video is a fellow called the Iconoclast, who is just the fucking worst. If you're a big follower of left-wing content on YouTube, you'll probably recognise him from the 3 Arrows video tearing him a new arsehole on the EU and the Kalergi plan, but if not, I'm going to do my best to do something similar here. So who is the Iconoclast? Well, he's a racist, possible fascist bigot, who sadly I share a country with, who basically just makes videos about how black people are going to make Europe worse by virtue of being black, how Muslims are all terrible, British Empire apologism. He literally uses the "but we ended slavery" argument, apparently forgetting the fact that in order to end slavery we first had to start it, multiple Tommy Robinson worship pieces and so on, you get the point. He's a probable fascist making videos on the internet. This is hardly news and certainly not uncommon at this point. He has had multiple videos taken off YouTube for breaking the terms of service, which of course he refers to as censorship, because videos with titles like LGBT versus Islam, the hypocrisy of the left, and white British becoming a minority, the Great Replacement, are of course completely inoffensive and were only taken down by YouTube's far left algorithm. He also makes and distributes his own Iconoclast magazine, which from what I can tell is a collection of essays written by fellow racists collected together in a glossy format. Doesn't use Patreon anymore after it purged a bunch of far-right creators for, once again, breaking the terms of service, and describes himself as British nationalist, anti-EU, pro-nation state, anti-mass immigration, pro-personal responsibility, and bloody handsome to boot. You may already be thinking at this point that this guy is a complete fucking dickhead. But wait, there's more. See, if you Google the Iconoclast, one of the first thing that comes up is an interview he did for Defend Europa. Yes, that Defend Europa. Here are some quotes from that interview to give you a taste of what a delightful individual we're going to be dealing with today. I don't think there is any one person who echoes my political beliefs exactly, but I do appreciate different people for different reasons. First of all, Nigel Farage, Jesus, has to be up there because of his tireless battling against the EU. The man has been smeared throughout the British media, threatened by left-wing activists on a constant basis, and has had to face down the cyborgs in the European Union for years, and he beat them all. Obviously, the Brexit process is still under threat, but Farage made such an impact on the people of Britain and the political sphere that forcing the referendum and subsequently winning it should always be seen as a massive triumph. I'd say the man has earned 3 pints for life. Farage is, of course, a tremendous racist, who rose to prominence by exploiting the racial prejudices present throughout much of British society, stoking the flames of fascism, providing a more acceptable face for the BNP, EDL-style groups of thugs who have been crying out for someone to give them more mainstream credibility. Much like Tommy Robinson, he is a rich, privileged racist who managed to convince the generation of simpletons that he is actually, just like them, a working class guy just looking out for the average British worker. Just ignore the fact that almost immediately after leaving school in 1982, he was able to start working in the City of London, trading commodities on the London Metal Exchange. Initially, he joined the American commodity operation of brokerage firm Drexel Burnham Lambert, transferring to Crédit Lyonnais Russe. that's probably not how that's pronounced, in 1986. He joined Refco in 1994 and the Texas Metals in 2003. He was a commodities trader, a stocks man, a city trader, and yet this is the man so many consider a working class hero. Another that instantly comes to mind is Enoch Powell. Obviously, he was way before my time, but in the modern age of mass-controlled immigration and ethnic replacement, many people are looking back at what he said all those years ago and are coming to the realization he was right. The personal sacrifices he made in order to speak the truth were immense, as his political career was effectively over after he made his famous Rivers of Blood speech, despite having the overwhelming support of the British people at the time. But when have they ever mattered? Typically the mainstream still look at him in a negative light, but slowly and surely more and more people are giving him their ears and are understanding that he absolutely saw the dangers of immigration, and in that respect he's been vindicated. One more politician, if we can even call him that, I need to mention is of course Donald Trump. Not because I agree with him on policy decisions, but because of what he, as a figure, represents. This is a guy who flipped the middle finger at the media, Washington, and anyone who attacked him, and only became stronger as he did so. He epitomizes perseverance. No matter what they say about him, no matter which dirty tactics the media implement, he always weathers the storm and comes out on top. He's inspired millions of people to come out of their shells and say what they really believe, when they would have been too fearful of social consequences beforehand. Too fearful of being beaten up for being racist, okay? He clearly understands that Western civilization has been undermined and talked down for years, and he wants to change that. His visit to Poland and his speech prove that. His concept of America first is brilliant, and it's something we should imitate for the UK. Looking out for your own people is a rather unpopular notion in modern Europe, unfortunately, but now that the Trump is out of the bag, more people with these sensibilities will follow. For those of you who don't know, Enoch Powell was a racist who, in 1968, basically parroted his own version of Great Replacement bullshit, culminating in his infamous Rivers of Blood speech, in which he suggested that in this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. Going on to say, we must be mad, literally mad, as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents, who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre, and described the plight of the white British people thusly. For reasons which they could not comprehend, and in pursuance of a decision by default, on which they were never consulted, they found themselves made strangers in their own country. They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighbourhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work, they found that employers hesitated to apply to the immigrant worker the standards of discipline and competence required of the native-born worker. They began to hear, as time went by, more and more voices which told them that they were now the unwanted. On top of this, they now learned that a one-way privilege is to be established by Act of Parliament, a law which cannot, and is not intended to, operate to protect them or redress their grievances. It is to be enacted to give the stranger, the disgruntled, and the agent provocateur the power to pillory them for their private actions. And of course, we don't need to say much more about Trump. I did speak for an hour and 8 minutes about why I believe that he's a fascist and his immigration policies are worryingly reminiscent of how genocides of the past have started, so I guess check that out if you're curious about my reasoning. The Iconoclast is a huge critic of what he calls the globalist elite, which he apparently believes is embodied by the EU, and what the rest of us call an anti-Semitic dog whistle that literally just means the Jews. So that aside, let's dig into a racist take on a Disney princess movie, shall we?
Now it's happened once or twice, someone couldn't pay the price, and I'm afraid I had to rake them across the coast. Yes, I've had the odd complaint, but on the whole I've been a saint to those poor unfortunate souls.
Okay, we've put it off enough. Let's actually get into talking about the subject of today's video. The Little Black Mermaid, indeed. The original isn't called The Little White Mermaid, you know.
So Ariel from The Little Mermaid is being recast as a black woman. Well, goodness me. I'm shocked that Disney would take a jab at white people. Who could have seen that coming, eh?
A black woman having the temerity to exist is not taking a jab at white people unless your identity is so fragile that seeing a black woman in a, let's be honest, judging by the recent crop of what Renegade Cut refers to as late-stage Disney movies, much worse than the original movie, is somehow an attack on all white people and whiteness in general, rather than, you know, a combination of capitalism and the actress presumably just being a good fit for the role. can I just say, I love the dark, serious, ominous tone set by the intro here, focusing on historical dictators, atrocities like the bombing of Hiroshima, and modern politicians discussing current events, immediately undercut by the fact that this video is about a live-action remake of a Disney cartoon in which a mermaid princess gets tricked by an evil witch because she wanted to go on land and meet a handsome prince. Like, maybe he should have had a more light-hearted intro for when he wants to make videos about movies or something. It's like No Bullshit, who despite his obnoxious but off-the-cuff ranting style has this weirdly slick CSI intro, which, you know, weird.
Hello and welcome back to No Bullshit. Today we're revisiting the very controversial new Star Wars movie.
I have to admit, I'm not really up to date on pop culture much these days. I used to be a massive film buff. I used to go to the cinema at least twice a week in my early 20s, and watch countless films on DVD in between. But now, my enthusiasm has fallen off a cliff, and it's been dead in the water for a number of years now.
Interesting, because in the aforementioned interview he did with Defend Europa, he said, "It's always nice to meet a fellow film lover. I could talk about them all day. A little bit of trivia for you. I used to have a movie review channel a couple of years ago, but after pouring so much effort and time into it over the course of a year to only gain about 85 subscribers, I realised I was barking up the wrong tree. In terms of reclaiming Hollywood and media from the left, I think it really comes down to encouraging artistic people on our side to create and share their work. One of the biggest problems with the right is artistic endeavours are usually relegated to the bottom of the list of things that are considered important. I completely disagree with this, because if we're serious about convincing more people to our way of thinking, we can't rely on reaching them through politics alone. Like it or not, film, music, literature, art, all of these things have tremendous reach and are being used by the left to spread heavy political messaging. We've abandoned that ground without a shot being fired. As a movement, we need to actively support creative people in their work and motivate more of them to go into business together. Only as a collective will we break into the entertainment industry, and I think it's high time we gave it a shot. But apparently, his love for films and desire to convince more right-wingers to break into the industry ended years ago. This interview was carried out in March of 2018, so this is either a lie or only technically true because it's more than a year, and therefore years is grammatically correct even if it's intellectually dishonest.
I don't think it's a coincidence that this drop-off has occurred in parallel to my political awakening. In fact, it's undeniable that the more right-wing I become, the fewer films I watch. It doesn't take a genius to work out why, does it?
I reckon it's because there are some black people and women in prominent and or powerful roles in movies nowadays, and as a racist and sexist, this makes him unhappy and uncomfortable. I mean, he could check out more niche movies that have right-leaning or no political subtext, but he chooses not to.
Modern Hollywood mainly acts as an arm of globalist politics. The messaging it puts out in its biggest and most profitable franchises always echoes the mainstream liberal dogma that the West has been consumed with.
That mainstream liberal globalist dogma, incidentally, basically boils down to it's okay to be black, female, gay, etc. Which makes me wonder, if that's all it takes to be a far-left piece of media, then is every movie starring a white guy right-wing?
Feminism, sexual liberation, diversity. It's all there.
The sexual liberation part is rather confusing to me. People who complain about shit like that always make me laugh because they're basically just outing themselves as people who are both terrible at and scared of sex, and specifically women who enjoy sex. It's rather concerning because it carries with it an implication that sex is about power, when in reality it's just a bit of intimate fun that can be shared by a couple or friends or strangers or whatever.
And it's all used frequently by the bigwigs who own the film industry, and we all know who those people are.
Well, I know that you think they're the Jews, but the rest of us don't believe in unhinged conspiracy nonsense, so I'm afraid that we don't know who they are because they don't exist outside of your brain.
I suppose the biggest example of this recently is the Star Wars franchise.
Oh god, will I ever be able to stop talking about The Last Jedi? I already have 3 more videos in my Star Wars series to make without covering it in my other videos as well.
Kathleen Kennedy, the head of Lucasfilm, has never been shy of showing off her feminist agenda, literally wearing it on her sleeve.
That's her chest, mate. I know right-wingers don't tend to spend much intimate time with adult women due to not respecting them in any way, shape or form, but that's what we call her chest, and what according to the internet would have been referred to as Cupid's kettle drums in Victorian slang. The sleeve is the bit that goes on your arm, mate, which is where you wear your armband, and the thing that comes towards you at great force when you voice your opinions on women in public. You know, just for future reference. Also, this The Force's female shirt, whilst admittedly cool, and definitely supports a lot of Kennedy's views, is not official Star Wars merch or anything, but is in fact made by Nike, in order to encourage more women to buy their Air Force One trainers. She didn't have these things made or anything.
In combination with this, Disney's insistence on forced diversity has manifested itself in the new films.
Forced diversity, for those of you who don't know, means there is a black man and a woman in the new series, unlike the original trilogy, which featured Lando and Leia, a black man and a woman, respectively.
With the end result being a crew of protagonists that essentially ticks off every box on the progressive list. A strong female hero, the ethnic minority supporting characters, a Hispanic man, a black guy, and an Asian woman.
Why is Chewie there? Are Wookiees a social minority in contemporary Europe?
There was even an outwardly racial activist droid in the Han Solo film, who constantly talked about droid civil rights. Oh, it was incredibly subtle.
Well, droids are not a race, but I think this character was more of a critique of class dynamics and the implicit overtones of slavery that a sentient underclass of AI creatures implies. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot of crossover with race, but it's not explicitly a race allegory. It's pretty standard AI stuff, but there is literally a scene where the droids start a proletarian revolution, so it's not like she's a direct allegory to black people. When Childish Gambino, who made This Is America, a masterful criticism and indictment of race relations in the US, is one of the main characters in the movie.
All of the old heroes from the original films have been pushed aside. They killed Han, Luke turned into a grumpy MGTOW, and Princess Leia, while getting a bit more leeway because she is a woman, still kind of just stood around, occasionally criticizing the men around her, along with her purple-headed friend.
They're old and can't carry another trilogy. Harrison Ford always wanted Lucas to kill Han. Luke's story is one of redemption and has nothing to do with MGTOW because he's not a misogynistic piece of shit, just disillusioned with the Force and racked by guilt over his own actions, which requires self-reflection, an ability MGTOW people lack, and Leia is a military leader who gets incapacitated halfway through the movie.
It was a clear message from Disney. The older white generation needs to step aside, and the new, multicolored, dynamic, young rainbow heroes are the future.
Obviously, the first response is, why is that a bad thing? But even ignoring that, has the Iconoclast seen Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull? Because that's what happens when you try to get the same actors recapturing the same action-oriented roles in their old age. And that movie came out in 2008. So now Harrison Ford is 11 years older than he was then, when he was still embarrassingly too old to be trying shit like this.
Of course, they still kept all the bad guys white, but you know, white people are bad, so that makes sense.
I mean, yeah, they're a Nazi allegory, so no shit, but also Kylo is the son of Han and Leia, so if he turned out black, I think someone might have some explaining to do.
The fan backlash to The Last Jedi in particular was massive. The film was downvoted across the internet, and thousands of people took to YouTube to vent their frustrations.
Thousands of whining losers did. Most people just had opinions one way or the other. Some loved it, some hated it, but it's no big deal really, it was just a controversial movie. From the looks of it, Episode 9 is going to undo a lot of stuff that happened in The Last Jedi though, which will really piss me off, I'm sure.
Because at the end of the day, Star Wars was a franchise for white men. I mean that in the sense that white men were the most likely fan base for the series.
What the fuck? How does he reckon that, do you think? Star Wars was a franchise for everyone. It had a couple of white guys in it, but it was the 70s and also included a black guy, a woman, and a weird bear creature.
Science fiction and fantasy are genres that, on the whole, appeal to this group of people the most.
Yes, because usually they star white men and are some of the most aggressively unwelcoming and gatekeepy genres to get into. Maybe, though, that's not a sustainable model, and a massive corporation like Disney has a vested interest in expanding the potential audiences for these genres. Also, name me one person below the age of 30 of any belief, colour or gender who hasn't read Harry Potter or seen Star Wars, and I'll show you a liar. It's time for white men to stop gatekeeping their favourite genres and let other people enjoy them.
Disney knew this too and set about trying to change that target audience. And you can only do that by pissing off the actual audience and aiming for a completely different demographic.
How does this happen, though? I get the logic that having a more diverse cast can bring in a more diverse audience, although unlike the Iconoclast, I don't think this is a bad thing, but how does that put off the original audience? Unless straight white cis men are so selfish that they think that every fantasy and sci-fi story has to involve someone who looks exactly like them, of course, which would be ridiculous considering the proportion of characters throughout media that do fall into this exact category.
This type of social engineering doesn't usually go down too well. But while the fans were rabid in their condemnation for the new direction Star Wars was taking, the films will still make a fortune at the box office, because Disney will push through their agenda and the consumers will buy tickets no matter what.
Almost as if this is a minor thing that the vast majority of people don't care about, and it's just vases sitting in the corner of the cinema crying and muttering about how Rose should have been white or something.
The phrase "get woke, go broke" simply doesn't apply to companies like Disney or franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.
It doesn't apply at all because it's a bullshit slogan that wasn't really given much thought before reaction reviews started throwing it around willy-nilly, and now it started backfiring as it becomes clear that it's not remotely accurate 99% of the time.
They're too big to fail, and they've monopolised the film industry to such an extent that they can push consumerism on the audience with no real resistance at all. You can whine about feminism all day long, but the truth is there's no point closing the stable door after the horse has bolted, and it certainly has here.
Maybe we should curb the capitalist hegemony, stopping Disney owning almost half of entertainment media, and put more restrictions and sanctions on companies that limits their ability to do things like this.
And this brings me on to the news that The Little Mermaid has been recast as a black woman, which has caused another huge internet stir among fans of the original.
No, it's caused a stir amongst racists. You can't tell me that all these adult white men are massive Little Mermaid fans and see this as disrespecting the character of Ariel, beloved of adult men the world over.
This time, instead of just having more feminism and general diversity, Disney have taken the step to go balls out and race swap an iconic white character.
Which is not a new thing. As the Iconoclast will later point out, this has been done multiple times before and will happen again in the future, most notably with Scarlett Johansson, who doesn't see the problem with her taking up roles that could more easily and accurately be portrayed by minority actors.
Again, the backlash will have been expected, but it doesn't matter. The film will still go on to make a truckload of cash regardless. Even the people raging at this decision, half of them will probably go see it as well, if for no other reason than to review it on their YouTube channels and complain even more.
Almost as if chocolate fucks like this are completely playing into Disney's hands by making content and causing the conversation around the casting choice to trend worldwide and get them millions of dollars of free advertising.
Now, I could use the rest of this video to moan about this casting choice and complain endlessly about it, but I actually want to look at the positive side of this, and there is a positive side of this, because we can use this casting choice and all future examples to our advantage.
Oh god, okay, here we go, this is going to be weird.
This debate about racial representation in Hollywood is simply a debate that we cannot win. The truth is, the left have been crying about whitewashing for years. They've made a hell of a noise whenever a non-white character from a novel, or usually a Japanese anime, is portrayed in a Western adaptation by a white actor. Back in my early 20s, I'd see various websites complaining about this constantly, places like Tumblr and BuzzFeed, and I'd always be utterly bemused by it. Because at the time, and this is important, I was still looking through a civic nationalist lens, and I didn't get the big deal. I'd say stuff like, well, what does race have to do with it? It's the writing and story that really matters. Little did I know that I was on the road to nowhere.
Yeah, I was on the same path but going opposite directions. I used to think that it didn't matter if Ghost in the Shell had a white woman in it because so long as they were the best fit, that's what mattered. Now, however, I believe that diversity is incredibly important and we should strive to make everyone feel happy and comfortable in their own skin. And if showing more people of colour, women, LGBTQ+ people, etc. in media, then we should absolutely try and do that as much as possible.
Fast forward to now, as Hollywood is recasting white characters as other races, and you can see how perception changes.
Okay, but you can't tell me that Kirsten Dunst was a better MJ than Zendaya. She is the best MJ to date and actually has personality outside of girl who gets kidnapped by the bad guy at the end of the movie. Casting her as a white actress would have almost certainly been a worse casting choice because Zendaya is pretty much ideal for the role as it's written in the MCU. Also, it makes complete sense for a story that takes place in Queens to have an extremely diverse cast because the alternative is to have a story set in an incredibly diverse area not reflecting the reality of real-life Queens.
Now it's the left who are repeating, why do you care about Ariel's race? She's a mermaid. That has nothing to do with it. It's just a Disney movie.
Yes, and they are correct to do so.
The double standard here is so obvious that it goes well beyond a debate around casting, because in the left's justification of this, They can't help but show their true colours in regards to white people as a whole, and their views on Western civilization and what it means to be European, and all of these questions that we constantly talk about in this corner of the internet.
Okay, so just to clear a couple of things up. One, it's much less of a big deal when a straight white cis male character gets cast as a different minority because there are still plenty of roles for those actors, and there isn't exactly a lack of representation for them in media. On the other hand, doing the opposite robs minority actors of a very small amount of roles available for them, as well as taking yet more media representation that minority groups are sadly lacking in mainstream media. It's nothing to do with victimizing white people or whatever. 2, Western civilization doesn't fucking mean anything. It's just a racist dog whistle to imply that in order to be a true Westerner or European, you have to be white.
Let me read you an official statement by a Disney channel named Freeform, who came out in defense of the new casting choice. Yes, the original author of The Little Mermaid was Danish. Ariel is a mermaid. She lives in an underwater kingdom in international waters and can legit swim wherever she wants. But for the sake of argument, let's say that Ariel too is Danish. Danish mermaids can be black because Danish people can be black. Black Danish people, and thus merfolk, can also genetically, 3 exclamation marks, have red hair. But spoiler alert, bring it back to the top. The character of Ariel is a work of fiction. So after all of this is said and done, and you still cannot get past the idea that choosing the incredible, sensational, highly talented, gorgeous Halle Bailey is anything other than the inspired casting that it is because she doesn't look like the cartoon one, oh boy, do I have some news for you about you. Cough, racists! The mental gymnastics of this statement are there for everyone to see. The statement acknowledges that The Little Mermaid is a Danish story. In fact, it's a Danish fairy tale, first published in 1837.
Yeah, this whole argument is ridiculous because, as this tweet points out, we are arguing semantics and genetics regarding a fictional magical mermaid princess, and insisting that she has to be a certain race or colour is ridiculous in that context. It's based on a Danish fairy tale, but takes certain liberties with the source material. For example, in the original, the mermaid doesn't have a friend who is a singing Jamaican crab.
One could argue that it could take a little seat at the table of European folklore. It's certainly a meaningful piece of European culture and history.
Yeah, but Disney does this all the time. All cartoons based on history and folklore do. Have you seen Anastasia? It's the story of how Rasputin, who is an evil wizard in this version, much like his appearances in basically every other modern media adaptation, hunts down and tries to kill the last of the Romanov children because he apparently killed her family and not the Bolsheviks, and Lenin doesn't fucking exist. And also there's a talking bat and a bunch of singing bugs.
I was once the most mystical man in all Russia. When the royals betrayed me, they made a mistake. My curse made each of them pay, but one little girl got away. Little Anya, beware, Rasputin's away. In the dark of the night, people will find her. In the dark of the night, revenge will be sweet when the curse is complete. In the dark of the night, she'll be gone.
Hi, ladies. Listen.
But even the original cartoon differs wildly from the original Danish version by, for example, toning down the deal with Ursula. In the original story, she cuts out Ariel's tongue, and her legs cause her immense pain to use, rendering her basically disabled. Oh, and if she fails to seduce the prince, she just dies, which eventually she does, though for different reasons. Also, Anderson's original work is rumoured to have been inspired by his own homosexual urges towards a close friend of his, wishing he could change his nature to be with someone he loved, and it suggested that the soulless nature of the mermaids are supposed to be reflective of society's attitudes towards homosexuality at the time, as, much like mermaids in the book, homosexuals were deemed unable to enter into heaven by mainstream religious interpretations at the time. Considering that the Iconoclast is probably a fascist and can't deal with cis-het women being sexually liberated, I doubt that he's particularly invested in that particular part of the novel coming to light. I genuinely wonder if he'd be happier if they stayed true to Anderson's intentions and recast Ariel as a merman and sent him off to seduce the prince, but that would probably just be degeneracy.
It's certainly much more historical than the, let's say for example, Japanese anime remade by Westerners that everyone on the left always flips out about, isn't it?
I do not give a single solitary shit about anime other than Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is the best cartoon ever made.
It's time to do.
but isn't most anime set in and almost entirely based around Japan and Japanese culture? I can completely understand being pissed off if the Americans tried making a live-action Akira.
No time to talk, guys! Evil scientists and wrinkly children in flying chairs are holding our friend Tetsuo captive and performing experiments on him! And the prom's tomorrow!
Starring an all-white cast, for example, but as someone who doesn't really know or watch anything about anime, I don't think I'm really qualified to make any judgments here.
There's no cultural appropriation argument coming from the left here. Nobody's sticking up for the Danish culture.
And what part of Danish culture is being tarnished by the existence of a black woman? Because you do realise that there are black women currently living in Denmark, right? And Denmark's doing just fine. In fact, it regularly tops the list of happiest places in the world.
I don't think many black people were in Denmark in 1837, though, I have to say.
This is wrong, but I'm glad he brought it up, because it caused me to do some research. I do love learning, and I discovered the story of Hans Jonathan, a Danish man who was brought in St. Croix. I'm going to stick with that. A Danish colony at the time. In 1784, the result of his mother, a house slave, presumably being raped by her master, he volunteered to fight in the navy and was considered by the state to be a free man. However, his former master's family attempted to reclaim him as a slave, and in 1802, a court declared him no longer a free man, so he fled to Iceland, where he lived until his death in 1827. Likewise, there was Mary Thomas, a slave who led an uprising in 1878, burning 50 plantations in what is now the American Virgin Islands. Now, these stories are, of course, unique, but it does show that the Danish were involved in slavery in the 19th century, and some slaves were actually brought back to Denmark rather than being left in the colonies. And all I had to do to find these stories was Google Black People Denmark 19th century. Something the Iconoclast clearly didn't bother to do, but this is all completely by the by because Ariel is a mermaid and her history is not the same as Danish history. As a resident and descendant of an ancient society of merpeople, presumably she could have descended from African mermaids, or maybe mermaids are just black and that's the way things are, because they're fantasy creatures and we can just say the sea god Neptune is black and made them in his image or something and have it make sense. We could justify Neptune being black by making the point that the Roman gods ought to represent all Roman citizens, which, thanks to the movement of people throughout the Roman Empire, which included large parts of Africa, not only could Neptune be justifiably black, but it could also explain how black mer people found their way to Denmark. But this is completely ridiculous to even think about discussing the realistic depiction of fucking mermaid genes.
And additionally, if Danish people can be black anyway, surely white people can be Japanese? Because if Danish people can be so genetically un-Danish, surely everyone else in the world can be equally whatever they are too.
Genetics have nothing to do with nationality. A black person born in this country is just as British as I am, and anyway, if you move a Danish family to Germany or something, is that kid genetically still Danish? How would that show up in DNA tests? How many generations does it take? How does that reconcile with the fact that most of European history has been one of conquest and movement of people? If I, for example, am genetically British, both sides of my family have been in the UK for at least 4 generations, as far back as any of my relatives can remember, but I should have parts of Norman, Roman, Viking, Anglo, and so forth. Likewise, are American white people genetically American? If not, can one pinpoint which specific country they're genetically a part of? And if so, then what are Native Americans? Also, there have been white people in much of South Africa for generations, but are they genetically African? Try telling an angry Afrikaner he can't identify as an African and expect a punch in the face.
And the insistence that The Little Mermaid is fiction, guys, as if because it's made up, race shouldn't even be a factor of discussion. Well, sorry to break it to you guys, but most things put out in Hollywood are fiction.
Yeah, but we're not discussing that it's fiction. We're saying that a fictional species of magical people who live in an underwater society can be whatever colour we fucking want them to be, because it makes no sense for them to be 100% comparable to land-based, normal, boring humans.
Yet the anger about racial casting is only allowed to go one way. To boil this down, white people in contemporary anime remakes bad, black people in 19th century historical Danish fairy tales perfectly fine, acceptable, and desirable. Glad we got that straight.
If they're supposed to be a Japanese person, maybe it's not as good an idea to try and recast them as a white person. This can actually be done well though, like take the Mandarin in Iron Man 3. I dislike Iron Man the character for a number of reasons, but I really liked what they did with the Mandarin, by turning him from a horrendous Asian stereotype into a white guy playing the part of an in-universe fictional stereotypical terrorist. They completely recontextualized and improved him without having to rely on stereotype or anything like that, and cast a minority role to star a white man.
People call me a terrorist. I consider myself a teacher. ready for another lesson?
My name's Trevor Slattery.
What are you? What are you, decoy? You're a double, right?
What, I mean, not an study? No, absolutely not. Don't hurt the face, I'm an actor.
Listen, it's making me sound like I actually care about The Little Mermaid or the Disney remake.
No, it makes you sound like you hate black people having representation in media and that white people need more despite the overabundance of movies starring cis-het white men for some inexplicable reason.
I really don't. I'm not going to go see it, but do you see what I mean about this being an unwinnable debate? Did you see how the very civilization that produced a story such as The Little Mermaid is trivialized and belittled and twisted to fit whatever narrative they want to spin?
I mean, not really. I don't think that Ariel being black really affects the original story in any meaningful way, and certainly doesn't push any kind of narrative other than, I guess mermaids can be black, that's cool.
This isn't about equal representation in entertainment, it's about racial supremacy in culture.
One black woman in a Disney movie that will probably be shit because all those late-stage Disney movies have been, is an example of the left pushing racial supremacy in culture despite the fact that straight white men overwhelmingly dominate Hollywood in all fields. So I mean, if you meant that arguing against putting a black woman in a movie is about maintaining white people's cultural supremacy, then fine, but don't accuse anyone else of doing the same.
It's about diminishing the icons of white fiction and stealing ownership of them. And in doing so, stealing the fruits of the culture itself to be used in a completely alien manner in the future.
First off, Ariel isn't an icon of white fiction. In fact, if you asked 100 people to name an icon of white fiction, 99 of them would probably think you're a weird racist, but I would almost guarantee you that none of them would cite Ariel. Even if we were to entertain this idea that changing the races of a couple of historical people is in some way a terrible thing to do because it destroys culture or whatever, the fact of the matter is that Ariel is a fictional mermaid who could very easily be explained away as being a descendant of some African race of mermaids, if we even need to explain it, which we don't, but she's not Danish. I agree that during a time when slavery was active, having a black prince or something might be a bit historically iffy, but the thing is, she's not even from Denmark, she's from the ocean, so she can be any fucking race, it doesn't matter. Besides that, I can't be certain, but I don't recall the Little Mermaid's skin colour being described at all in the original, though I may be wrong in that, it's been a while since I last read it.
For whatever ends the powers that be desire.
The powers that be, in this case, is apparently the Jews, remember?
Why are we always told it's important to have a black James Bond? Why do people say it would be a great step forward, a breath of fresh air, another barrier broken down?
It's not really. James Bond is a fucking scumbag, whatever colour he is. But rather interesting that there have been almost 30 Bond movies, 9 actors playing the character, etc. since the 1960s, and even now there's apparently a female Black 007. She's not Bond, she's just taking his code number. A better argument could be made for Doctor Who, in which we're told that the Doctor's regeneration can be tricky and unpredictable, and yet so far we've had 14 Doctors, innumerable Masters, and not one single black person. We've had a female Doctor and a female Master, which is cool, but not one single non-white Time Lord. At least main characters, outside of background appearances.
Why can't a new separate character be created who is black? Why wouldn't a white Shaft carry the same weight? Or a white Panther? Well, it's obvious. Shaft and Black Panther are black characters and nobody would ever dream of recasting them as anything other than black, because they're culturally significant to black people.
This is not how race and the media representation thereof works. James Bond's character is not intrinsically tied to his race or even really gender, so a black Bond would be perfectly reasonable, or even a female Bond, but Shaft's character is informed by his race, and Black Panther is literally about an African prince learning how to rule his kingdom and deals with themes including colonialism and the legacy thereof, interventionism, African traditions and cultures, and so on. These characters wouldn't work with a white actor playing them, and if you don't see that, then I'm sorry to say that you should probably research more into race theory when it comes to analysing media and not make up areas of study like race realism when it comes to being a dick to black people. It's not about them being culturally significant to black people, it's about their race being essential to their character. Give me one thing about James Bond that wouldn't work with a black actor.
James Bond is unmistakably white, unmistakably British. The character is also entwined with those identities. But Mr. Bond, I'm afraid, doesn't get the same cultural protection as Shaft and Mr. Panther.
James Bond is only unmistakably white because he's been historically played by a white man. That doesn't mean he can't. Also, there's nothing un-British about someone like Idris Elba, who, to be honest, is probably more British than me, which the Iconoclast just showed a headline suggesting when talking about the possibility of a black Bond, so the only conclusion I can possibly draw from this is that he doesn't think black people are really British, which is just categorically incorrect.
And the truth is, having a black actor portray the iconic spy would attack the very idea of Britishness at its core. It would be another hurdle cleared, and then they'd be on to the next, and that's the goal.
Why would it? Why does a black secret agent attack the idea of Britishness, unless the Iconoclast believes that black people are all some alternative nationality or something? Maybe he's using the 3/5 argument, I don't know. Also, good use of the they again there, to avoid referring openly to the Jews again. What is the goal here, though? So, the Jews, globalist elite, make a few more movies with black people in them, and then what?
But the positive aspect of all of this is more and more white people are waking up to the aggressive agenda being used against them. Surely the fans getting angry at a black Little Mermaid understand somewhere within them what is going on.
Amazing. So a bunch of white men will see that a black woman is in a movie they were never going to see anyway because it's for little girls, and then rise up, become white nationalists, whine on the internet like tiny babies. Huge win in the battle of ideas.
They can't cling to the same old excuses anymore about racial identity not mattering, because clearly it does. If it didn't, why are people pissed off? Why are people even bothering to comment on it at all?
Yes, it does. I'm glad the Iconoclast has finally come out in support of identity politics, because I absolutely believe that we need to discuss various identities, minority or otherwise, and talk about what they mean and how best to get them to work together.
How can they attack the left on one hand by saying race shouldn't matter, only the story should, and then on the other hand foam at the mouth about a mermaid being the wrong colour? Has the penny dropped yet, lads?
Is he arguing against his own point here?
This is just a microcosm of the bigger war being waged, the war of identity. What makes us us? What makes a nation a nation?
Any number of things. To be honest, I could be a dick and say that technically the arbitrarily drawn borders on a map define where a nation begins and ends, but really it's a question with 1,000 answers. We could say shared values, a sense of belonging or community, a set of beliefs, and so on and so forth. But of course what the Iconoclast wants us to think, and has primed us to jump to this conclusion by associating nationality and race throughout this video, is that what makes us truly British or Danish or whatever is the colour of your skin, even though I, a white man, could go to Denmark and be much more of an outsider than a black Danish person, and a black British person would feel equally out of place in Johannesburg as would a white South African in Manchester. Race and nationality are not and cannot be the same thing.
Why does the race of a cartoon character matter in the grand scheme of things?
It doesn't, and yet here you are making this video.
Why do so many people care?
Because there's a lot of racists out there.
The answer is, even though Hollywood and other global entities have flooded our culture and brains with nonsense and propaganda for decades, they can never truly extinguish the feeling we all have deep within us, the natural belonging we feel to our fellow people and homes.
The problem is that when he says fellow people, he means fellow white people, whereas I wouldn't, because I'm not a flamboyantly racist buffoon.
Hollywood want you to feel bad for feeling this way. They want you to feel like a racist for not being cool with a black Little Mermaid.
Yeah, but you probably are, though. I mean, if your biggest problem with Disney repackaging and making their greatest hits from the 90s but adding in the tiniest sliver of representation, the foo is not gay representation, fuck you, is, but there's a black in it now, then yeah, you're fucking racist, mate.
And that's why they'll continue to take bolder and bolder steps with their casting choices. Shame, guilt, suppression. Shame, guilt, suppression. Over and over again. The way forward, although obviously tough, is for people on our side to retake the culture. And to do that, we need to start creating again. Hollywood can't create anything new. That's why they're stuck in an endless cycle of remakes and reboots, endlessly trying to milk the teat of the cow. We need to stop consuming things we've already bought 1,000,000 times before and do something new.
Actually, that would be down to capitalism. Also, I thought he didn't like watching movies anymore. How is someone going to get into a position to make a huge Hollywood blockbuster with right-wing themes and only white men in it if one doesn't bother to keep up the speed with popular movies and trends, and doesn't want to work their way up the Hollywood hierarchy and refuses to compromise? Because that's never going to change. You can make indie movies and put them up at festivals or YouTube or something, but that doesn't even begin to compare. Even if you somehow manage to make a low-budget indie movie that takes off and makes you a millionaire overnight, and you get picked up for directing gigs by the major studios, you're not going to have the same level of creative control as you might have had over your original project. And now the corporate executives are getting involved, taking out your racist and or fascist themes, your right-wing ideology and dog whistles, etc., because they recognise that that would probably cause the movie to sell less well with certain demographics and so on. Make your own crypto-fascist movie if you want, but don't expect to be able to compete with Disney, and certainly don't think that your racist ideology can compete with today's performatively woke movie marketing. Representation in media is good, but it would be great if the companies benefiting financially from it actually help to reduce the systemic inequality in the industry, instead of just putting a sticker on it saying, "We're not racist." If you want to have your fascist movie be as successful as a Disney remake of a classic animated princess movie, you might have to tear down capitalism first, is all I'm saying. But I doubt the Iconoclast would want to do that.
We've long ignored and disengaged from pop culture. We write it off as degenerate and harmful, and I've done it too. I've done it in this very video, in fact. I understand.
Well, yeah, you do, because fascists like you really genuinely think that anything that isn't a story about a heroic white man saving the day from a bunch of lefty cultural Marxists and then getting to fuck the woman they've been disrespecting for the 2-hour runtime as a reward at the end is degenerate. Earlier you had a go at sexual empowerment, as if it were a bad thing, and apparently black people just existing is degenerate now, so forgive me, but I'm starting to see a concerning trend with some of your statements.
But we have to remember that we can contribute to it. We can try and change it, you know. I know we have lots of creative people on our side. We do. And maybe it's time that we help them.
Yeah, maybe you could make some propaganda videos at a Trump rally or something.
Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you'd like to support my channel, the usual ways apply. My PayPal link is down below. And you can still buy the Iconoclast magazine issue 4 on my website. Link is down below as well. Okay, see you soon. Have a good one. Cheerio.
I tried to find a copy of his magazine without having to buy it, but I was sadly unsuccessful. Well, that was delightful. What did we think of that then? A fucking abomination? A racist, endlessly offensive rant about how black people shouldn't be in white people's movies because of genetics or something? Honestly, fascists fucking disgust me. Anyone who thinks they're better than someone else because of the colour of their skin, or that just featuring someone non-white in a piece of media is some kind of attack or conspiracy does. The Iconoclast is a bigot, and a dangerous and sadly local one. He's relatively savvy, or at least not all that stupid. He's not a right-wing thug going about beating black people up or spray painting a swastika on someone's house that we know of, but he is sitting here slowly and effectively convincing people that having a black woman in a Disney movie is some kind of betrayal of the white man. The Iconoclast is wrong about The Little Mermaid, just as he was wrong about the EU and Tommy Robinson and the Muslims, but he's convincingly wrong, and honestly that's worse, because the facts mean nothing if you're able to convince people that you were right all along and to ignore the facts altogether, because actually they were made up by the globalist elite in order to make movies more diverse or something. From now on, all elves, mermaids, goblins, dwarves, centaurs and so on should be black, partly because it'll piss people like this off, but also because as magical creatures, there's no way anyone can realistically start arguing that in reality they should be white because genetics, without coming across as both racist and a loser who doesn't understand that there's no such thing as DNA testing an orc.
Well, I was a lad in a fishing town. The old man said to me, you can spend your life, your jolly life, just sailing on the sea. You can search the world for pretty girls till your eyes are weak and dim. But don't go searching for a mermaid, son, if you don't know how to swim. 'Cause her hair was green as seaweed,